Hello everyone, my name is Jason, and today I want to share a personal story from my life. My parents abandoned me after their divorce, but years later, I inherited $1 million from my grandfather, and now my family is suddenly back in my life, asking for money to cover my half-siblings' needs and my dad's debts. I'm a 21-year-old man, and my family abandoned me when I was around 12. It all started when my parents separated when I was 11. I didn't see it coming because everything seemed fine between them. One day, they sat me down and told me they were getting divorced. At first, I thought they were joking because I had always assumed that divorces involved a lot of conflict and fighting like what I'd heard from my friends. But in my case, it was a quiet, unexpected divorce. They both admitted to being involved with other people. My mom planned to move out with her new boyfriend, while my dad's partner would be moving into our home. They agreed on joint custody, with my mom living only a couple of miles away, so I could alternate weeks between them. I didn't have much of a say in the matter, and all I could do was sit there and cry as my family broke apart. Both of my parents promised me I would always be their top priority. They tried to make it better by offering me things like video games, vacations, and other material gifts. But I didn't want any of that. I just wanted us all to stay together as a family. It was incredibly difficult to watch my mom pack up her things and leave, while at the same time, my dad's partner was moving in, setting up her belongings in what had been my parents' bedroom. My mom and dad separated on relatively good terms, but my dad's new partner had twin boys close to my age, and they made it clear they didn't like me, just as much as I didn't like them. My mom's boyfriend had a daughter from a previous relationship, but she lived with her own mother. After my mom moved out, she became pregnant with her boyfriend's child, and things only became more awkward and complicated. It started to feel like I didn't belong there anymore. At my mom's place, her husband seemed uncomfortable with me being around, and their public displays of affection in front of me made me uncomfortable. At my dad's house, I felt unwelcome because of my stepmother and her sons. Eventually, I spent more and more time at my aunt's place, my dad's older sister, who was also my godmother. She was 10 years older than my father and lived alone, so I would occasionally stay with her. After about a year of shuffling between my parents' houses, I decided to live with my aunt permanently. It took over 3 months for my parents to even notice. My mom thought I was staying at my dad's, and my dad assumed I was with my mom. Neither of them bothered to check on me. They were both so caught up in their new lives that they seemed to forget about me. My aunt was truly my savior. She made me feel loved and wanted, taking me out for dinners, movies, and even bringing me along on her vacations. During the summers, we would visit my grandfather's farm in the countryside, which was always a lot of fun. At first, my dad would send my allowance to my aunt, but after a while he stopped. Sometimes my aunt would remind him, but other times she would just let it go. I started feeling guilty for relying on my aunt, so I began working for her to earn my keep. She owned a plant nursery, and after school, I'd help her with the business. I also did household chores like taking out the trash and running errands. It was enjoyable living with her, but meanwhile my parents seemed to forget they even had a son. They would forget my birthdays, only calling after my aunt reminded them. They would say how much they loved me, but their actions said otherwise. There were times when I overheard my aunt calling them to let them know I was sick, but neither of them ever came to check on me. Even on my graduation day, neither of my parents showed up. My aunt was the only one there to celebrate with me. When my aunt called them out for neglecting me, they would apologize, but by then, I had grown so resentful that I stopped answering their calls altogether. Eventually, they gave up trying, and I heard through my aunt that they were blaming me for becoming distant and rude. I decided I wouldn't let their blame affect me. I made up my mind. I didn't want them in my life anymore. After graduating, I went to university and moved out of my aunt's house, but I still visit her every few months. I make sure to be there for her birthdays and holidays because, over the years, we've grown very close. I'm in my final year at university now. 3 months ago, my grandfather on my father's side passed away. It was a heartbreaking time for both me and my aunt, as we were the closest to him. My dad and uncles rarely visited Grandpa, but ironically, they all showed up for his funeral, and, of course, at the lawyer's office to hear the reading of his will. To their surprise, Grandpa left everything to my aunt. His 150-acre farmland, the farmhouse, and $1 million in cash. The rest of his money went to charity. It may seem harsh, but if you knew the full story, it would make sense. Briefly, Grandpa had been unwell for a long time and had wanted to see his sons before he passed. Despite my aunt repeatedly asking her brothers to visit, none of them did. So, in his final days, my aunt moved in to take care of him while my uncle stayed away. By that time, I had already moved out for university. After my aunt inherited the property, she called me home, her home, the one I consider my real home. She told me she was giving me the $1 million that Grandpa had left her. I was overwhelmed with happiness, not just because of the money, but because it showed how much she cared for me. When I lived with her, I often talked about my dreams of starting my own business and building something from the ground up. She remembered that and asked me to use the money to pursue that dream. I was so touched that I hugged her and cried. Without her, my life would have been so much harder. It didn't take long for the news of my inheritance to reach my parents. Suddenly, they started showering me with attention and affection, calling frequently to check on me. I told them to back off. I didn't want them in my life again. Last week, my dad even showed up at my dorm unannounced. Of course, he got the address from my aunt. I bet neither of my parents even remember which university I attend. He told me how proud he was that I would be graduating this year and praised me for all my accomplishments. But then, he asked why I wasn't visiting his home. I asked him, "When was the last time you called?" He stood there in silence for a moment before responding, "Oh, you're still upset about the divorce? Come on, move on. We both love you, and your mother misses you. Let me drive you home, and we can have dinner together." I told him to back off. "The only family I have is my aunt. You both abandoned me a long time ago, so stop pretending with this fake love. I know why you're really here. It's because of the $1 million, right?" He was quiet for a moment and then said he had no ulterior motive, only love. He claimed he was here to apologize and wanted me back in his life. He also mentioned hearing that my graduation was coming up and wanted to make sure I invited them, unlike my school graduation when I didn't call either of them. I was tired of the conversation and cut it short, telling him I had a class to attend. Later that day, I got a voicemail from my mom. She said she was expecting an invitation to my graduation. She explained that neither she nor my dad had gone to university, so they had always dreamed of me going. Now that I was about to graduate, she was excited for me. The truth is, I don't want either of them at my big day. I talked to my aunt about it, and she said it was my decision but suggested I consider reconciling with them. I'm torn. I don't know if they genuinely care or if they're just trying to reconnect because of the money. Many people have asked about my aunt and how she was able to accommodate me for so many years. When I moved in with her, she was in her late 50s. Her husband had died in an accident when I was a baby, maybe 1 or 2 years old. My aunt has a daughter, but she moved out when she was a teenager to attend medical school. Now she's a cardiologist living in the UK. My aunt has been living alone for a long time and never dated anyone after her husband passed away. My cousin and I even tried to set her up with a few people, but she wasn't interested. She always said she loved her plants and was content taking care of them. Some people have also suggested that I might have been too harsh on my parents, saying they had every right to separate and remarry. I agree they have the freedom to choose their own partners, but that doesn't excuse neglecting their child when a new family comes into the picture. My parents did just that. They initially promised I would split my time between them 1 week at Dad's and 1 week at Mom's. But even when I was with them, they often made plans without including me. Dinners were planned for after I left. They would even talk like this in front of me, saying things like, "Oh, he's here this week. Let's go out next week instead." How would you feel if your parents acted like that? I think I've mentioned before that shortly after my mom moved in with her boyfriend, she got pregnant. They would display affection in front of me, which was unbearable. Once, they took me on a 2-day trip but made me stay in the room the whole time while they went out sunbathing. When they were in the room, they asked me to sit outside on the balcony. Even though I was just 11, I knew exactly what was going on inside. I could hear everything. It was gross, and that man wasn't even my father. How could anyone expect me to want to stick around after that? I stopped going to my mom's place after that. Dad was slightly better than Mom. He would sometimes try to include me in his plans, but his stepsons would throw tantrums, and then he would say, "Okay, maybe next week we can go fishing." But that next week never came because by then, I would be at Mom's house. Over time, I realized that my parents had an unspoken agreement. Whenever one didn't want to deal with me, they'd say, "Let's do it next week," knowing I'd be with the other parent by then. One time, Dad managed to take me along on a family vacation, and it was horrible. The first day, his wife and her sons kept him busy, and I felt completely neglected. Even when it came to taking family pictures, they asked me to take photos of them. I wasn't in any of the pictures. Out of all the photos taken, only 4 had me in them. In 3 of them, I was alone, and in 1, I was with Dad. I guess now I've given enough context to explain why I felt the way I did about my parents. As for the present situation, like I said, my parents suddenly wanted to be a part of my life again. They claimed it was because they wanted to be at my graduation, saying it was a proud moment for them. But I told them I didn't want them there on my big day. Where were they during my high school graduation? Busy with their new families, that's where. When they kept pushing, I eventually said, "Okay." But I didn't actually invite them. I even got extra hall tickets just in case they showed up uninvited. But they didn't. They completely forgot about my graduation, and I made sure my aunt didn't reveal the date to them. It's been almost a month since my graduation, and neither of them has called to ask about it. Clearly, the graduation was just an excuse to reconnect with me. Almost 2.5 months after my graduation, my mom finally called. She told me my half-sister had graduated from primary school and was now enrolled in a private elementary school, but they were short on funds and wanted me to pitch in. I was stunned by her demand. When I asked why, she said, "She's your sister, so you should help with her education." She didn't waste any time getting to the point. She said, "We know your aunt gave you her $1 million inheritance. Your sister needs you. This is your time to step up as a big brother." I stopped her right there and said, "Hold on. You must be delusional. I've never even met this sister you're talking about. Where were you when I needed a mom? When I was sick and cold, you were nowhere to be found." She started sobbing and said, "What can I say if you're still stuck in the past? I thought you had a huge sum of money, so why not use it for your sister's education in a private school?" I had plenty to say, but I held back. Instead, I simply replied, "I have plans for that money, and I can't spare a penny for anyone else." She hung up after that, not even bothering to ask how my graduation went. It was clear, their sudden interest in my life was only because of the money. I was still trying to process that conversation when, one day, I got a call from a bank. They wanted me to pay off my dad's defaulted mortgage. I asked how they even got my number, and they said my dad had given it to them. Apparently, he had taken out a personal loan and hadn't paid the mortgage for several months. When the bank started chasing him for the money, he directed them to me, claiming he was out of funds. First, I panicked. I had no idea how these things worked and thought I might be legally obligated to pay his debt just because I was his son. Thankfully, I didn't give in to the pressure. I told the bank I needed to talk to my dad first, but instead, I called a friend who was in his final year of law school. He wasn't a full lawyer yet, but he knew a lot about these kinds of situations. He reassured me that I wasn't legally responsible for my dad's debt. I asked him why the bank would even call me, and he explained that the recovery agents have the right to ask anyone if they're willing to cover the debt, but I was under no obligation to pay. Armed with that knowledge, I decided not to contact my dad. I knew he would beg me to pay the mortgage. Instead, I waited for the bank to call again. A week later, they called back, asking when I was going to pay. The recovery agent tried using a forceful tone, probably to intimidate me, but this time I stood my ground. "Who gave you the right to talk to me like this?" I asked. "Did I default on the mortgage?" "No." "So, you'd better watch your tone, because I'm not paying a penny. Contact the person who actually defaulted, not me." They quickly apologized and hung up. I didn't need to lecture them, but I did it on purpose, knowing they would turn their frustration back on the real defaulter, my dad. A couple of hours later, I got a call from my dad's wife, and no, I can't call her mom or even stepmom. She was furious, yelling at me over the phone, asking what I had said to the recovery officers. Apparently, they were so angry they grabbed my dad by the collar and threatened to break his bones. I stayed calm and simply said, I told them to go after the person who took the loan, not me. She yelled back, don't you have any heart for your dad? He's struggling to pay the mortgage, and you're just turning away, even though you have all that money. I replied, no, I don't have any heart for him because he didn't have one for me. His heart was for you and your sons. So why don't you all help him out? I'm sure the money was meant for you. She hung up after that. Later that night, Dad called. He was drunk, not angry, but sobbing. He apologized for all the mistakes he made, admitting that he hadn't treated me right, especially in front of his stepsons. He said a lot of things, basically trying to show how sorry he was and how he realized his wrongs. He told me he wanted to make things right. I told him, I don't want to talk about the past, and I definitely don't want you back in my life. He continued to plead, saying he was remorseful and asking me to forgive him. I said, sorry and remorse don't matter to me anymore. I've learned to live without you all, and I'd like to keep it that way. Now, I'm not sure if I did the right thing by denying him the money. I do feel bad that the bank officials went after him. Part of me wonders if this is all just an act to emotionally manipulate me for money, because if he had asked directly, I would have refused, just like I did with Mom. What do you all think? After writing the last update, I felt guilty and was about to call Dad to ask how much he needed. But before I could, I received an email from Mom inviting me to dinner. It said, sorry we couldn't make it to your graduation day, so we want to do something for you. Just the three of us, like old times. Me, Dad, and you. I wasn't particularly excited about reminiscing over old family times, but I accepted the invite anyway, thinking it might be a way to finally end all this. When I showed up, it was more of the same. Apologies, remorse, and talk of forgiveness. They wanted to get back together as a family. I played along, nodding and smiling, curious to see where this was going. Then, out of nowhere, Mom said, sweetheart, we were wondering what plans you have for the money. I looked at her and she quickly added, no, I mean, Dad and I could give you some good investment advice. You're still young to make such big decisions on your own. I casually replied, yeah, my aunt is helping me with that, so I'm good, thanks. The room went silent for a few minutes. Then Mom came back with, you know, Dad's been having trouble because he defaulted on the mortgage. I nodded. I know, but Dad, why did you take out a personal loan for the business? He lowered his head and muttered, it was for my son's college. Before I could respond, Mom chimed in, it doesn't matter what the reason was. The point is, Dad's in trouble and we need to help him. I was thinking, why don't you clear off his mortgage, and then his stepsons can pay you back once they start working? And the rest of the money, you could help me out by putting your half-sister in a private school. She'll pay you back once she's older and earning, my mom said. I calmly replied, how about we just finish our dinner in silence and call it a day? That sarcastic comment set her off. She completely lost it, yelling at me, accusing me of still being that attention-seeking brat who only cared about himself. I responded, yeah, that's exactly who I am. I could have gone into a long lecture about their behavior, but honestly, who has time for that? They already knew I had an education loan to pay off, yet they still had the audacity to ask me to use my money to cover my stepbrother's loan and my half-sister's private school fees, all while expecting me to work hard to clear my